Welcome back to Judgment Decision Making. My name's Dr. Padilla. Now we're going to talk about hierarchies. Last week we discussed about the distinction of us versus them and how with very little information we can separate people into them and us. And then we begin to reorganize ourselves in accordance to these arbitrary group definitions and begin to think that we are very different than them in some capacities. That has lots of implications for how we make decisions in the world. Now what we're going to talk about today is how we organize ourselves within a group, how we create a hierarchy in order to determine what appropriate action is in social circumstances. Now, a hierarchy is a ranking system that formalizes equal access to limited resources. And you can think of the limited resources as really anything. It's money, it's prestige, it's access to healthcare in this country at least. Anything that you desire, there will be limited amounts of access based on different types of hierarchical structures within our society today. And you can see how obsessed we are in hierarchies if you look at all of these tabloid media that we have. The whole purpose of gossip magazines is to determine if someone else is changing their status, if the queen is sort of perceiving people as a different status because they left the royal family. We can also see this in our obsession with being interested in looking at celebrities' homes. How tantalizing is it to see what they have so we can determine where our social status is in comparison to people that we will never meet and we will never know, that do not affect our lives whatsoever. We are obsessed with hierarchies. Now, unfortunately, the quality of life also varies with consequence of rank inequalities. There was a study with 47 countries that showed the more income inequality, the more pre-adolescent bullying in schools. Countries with more brutal socioeconomic hierarchies produce children who enforce their own hierarchies more brutally. So this is something that students and children learn at a very early age, to reinforce hierarchies. So when you see these countries that have very strict hierarchical systems, and there's lots of disparities between those, you'll see children instituting those hierarchies as well. We, of course, belong to multiple different hierarchies, and we can have varying ranks within them. I'd like you to take a second to think about which hierarchies that you belong to. I'll point out that one of the ones all your professors belong to is a hierarchy within academics and researchers. This is interesting because we actually have specific metrics about where we rank in the hierarchical system. Here is a Google Scholar citation index for myself showing how many citations I have across a variety of years. And if I wanted to, I could look up my colleagues' rank, and these rankings dictate whether we get tenure or not, whether we get these large grants. All of these important things that we care about are dictated by our comparison to all of our different colleagues, and it has a number associated with it. We are fantastic at detecting rank within 40 milliseconds. It's all we need to reliably distinguish between dominant faces and subordinate ones. They've done a really wide range of studies indicating this. I'll show you a few pictures and see if you can detect subtle differences in hierarchy. So here I want you to think, can you identify who is the dominant character in this group and who is the least dominant? Okay, let's do one more. How about here? Can you identify who is most dominant and who is least dominant? Now, of course, in class, I would have everyone vote, and I would argue, or hopefully, we would see that the majority of people would begin to agree on which individuals are most and least dominant, even in these very subtle social situations, because we have so much practice automatically trying to identify these hierarchy distinctions. What happens in our brain when we begin to contemplate rank? The prefrontal cortex is activated. Frontal damage impairs skills at recognition of dominance relations, along with recognition of kinship, deception, or intimacy in faces. The frontal part of the brain is associated with this. And the one that I'll point out is also the amygdala. When the social hierarchies are unstable, or if you do not know where you're ranked within a social hierarchy, your amygdala is activated. That's the area that's associated with fear and aggression. So it's a very uncomfortable situation if we don't know where we stack up in a hierarchy system. Now let's talk about stress. Studies show that worse stress-related health typically occurs in middle management, with a killer combo of high work demands but little autonomy, responsibility without controls. And I think we've all experienced this. If you're in a situation where there's lots of demands on you, but you have little control over how the job is executed, that's a very stressful circumstance. And stress is very key to this hierarchy structure, because stress has massive negative impacts for our health and long-term life as well. One way to organize this is to look at social dominance orientation, SDO. This is actually a measure of how much people value power and prestige. One study, subjects viewed someone in an emotional pain. This activates the areas of the brain associated with empathy and disgust for the circumstance that evoked the pain. What they found is that the higher someone's SDO score, socio-dominance orientation, the less active those two regions. So those with most interest in prestige and power seemed least likely to feel for those less fortunate. And if we think about the implications for our leadership, individuals that lead massive countries, they are likely to have lots of desire for power and prestige. So they're also likely to be the people who are less able to sympathize with people under pain. And when there's circumstances like the coronavirus happening or a natural disaster, it seems odd that we have individuals who run our countries that likely have less of ability to sympathize with people less fortunate. Now I want to talk about how poverty relates to health, and specifically which comes first, poverty or poor health. And there's overwhelming evidence to suggest that poverty produces poor health and not the other way around. And the reason we're discussing this in this particular chapter is that poverty is one of the key items that we're trying to avoid with different status. Individuals of the highest status tend to have the most money. Individuals lower down have less money. And that's not just an issue of money, it also produces poor health outcomes. The problem isn't that the poor have less healthcare access or exposure to more health risk factors. It's what the research suggests. They've done studies in countries where everyone has access to healthcare, where the poor aren't exposed to toxins or chemicals in the water, and they still find that people who are poor have poor health outcomes as well. The gradient seems to be about the psychological baggage associated with SES, and SES stands for socioeconomic status. Subjective socioeconomic status predicts health at least as accurately as objective SES measures, meaning that it's not about being poor, it's about feeling poor. And when do you feel poor? When you are comparing yourself to someone else. If you are a billionaire and you live next to a trillionaire, you're going to feel very poor even though you're relatively rich. Independent of absolute levels of income, the more income equality in a community, the worse the health outcomes. And I think a really fantastic example that we've had of this recently, illustrated in the media, was with the movie Parasite. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It did a great job of illustrating the massive disparities in income and how when you're packed into these small areas, these discrepancies seem so much larger. They're of course quite large, but when you're doing direct comparisons, it really magnifies the effects. And that's when you see these really poor health outcomes as well. If you're in a social group and you're doing pretty good in comparison to everyone else, you're going to feel fine. But when you start comparing yourself outside of that group, that's when you start to see these issues. The psychological stress of low SES is what decreases health. And diseases that are most sensitive to stress, cardiovascular disease, psychiatric disorders, among others, are those that show the steepest SES by health gradient, meaning they're the most impacted by the negative health outcomes associated with low socioeconomic status. Summary here. Human quality of life, including health and stress, varies with the consequences of ranking inequalities. We can detect rank very quickly. It's almost automatic, and we are very attuned to it because we like to practice it a lot. Those with the most interest in prestige and power seem least likely to feel for those less fortunate. And poverty leads to poor health via the stress response to hierarchical comparisons.